Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of Career Tea. I'm your host, Sora, and I'm beyond excited to be back in 2025 after taking about a month off at the end of last year. We all need a little bit of a break sometimes to regroup and restructure, but now we're back kicking off the new year with more inspiring stories. Today's guest is someone whose career journey spans military service, advanced degrees, and big plans for the future. Norberto Perez spent over a decade in the U.S. Coast Guard, earned a master's in project management from Troy University, and is currently pursuing his MBA at MIT Sloan School of Management. We're going to dive into his transition from life in the Coast Guard to academia and everything in between. Norberto, welcome to the show. Happy New Year, and how are you feeling today?
So thanks so much for having me, and Happy New Year's to you as well. I really appreciate that kind introduction, and so grateful to be here on your podcast to share a little bit about my experience in the Coast Guard and my journey to MIT Sloan.
Of course, I'm so thrilled to have you here. You've got such a unique background, Coast Guard veteran, project management expert, and now MBA candidate at MIT. That's quite a journey. So let's dive right in. Let's start by talking about, your studies. You're in a Bachelor's of Science in Electrical Engineering at the U.S. Coast Guard Academy, then completed a Master's of Science in Project Management at Troy University, and now you're at MIT Sloan. You're essentially doing it all, and that's a quite academic journey that you're having. So I want to start by asking you, what led you to choose these specific areas of study, and did one of them naturally lead you to the next one?
Certainly. So I'll take myself back to high school. So I was a junior in high school. I was starting to look at different colleges and universities, and I didn't actually really know what I wanted to study. I think that's a common challenge when you're in high school, where you maybe are thinking about the future and you don't exactly know where you want to end up. So what I did was I focused on the things that I was passionate and interested in, which for me at that time were service to community and really giving back and working with people. And I stumbled across the U.S. Coast Guard Academy as an opportunity to not only get a bachelor's degree, but also pursue a passion of mine, which was serving and giving back. Another factor that came into play for me was figuring out how I was going to finance my education. And I wasn't sure if I was going to be able to take out the loans to go to school. The U.S. Coast Guard Academy created a great opportunity where I could go to school without tuition costs, and then I would owe years of service. So the idea of free college tuition and then serving an organization that I felt aligned with my personal values was something that helped me to get there. And ultimately, I went to the Coast Guard Academy. I studied electrical engineering. I chose electrical engineering. Well, for one, there's only 9 majors at the U.S. Coast Guard Academy. Everybody graduates with the Bachelor's of Science. And I really liked the electrical engineering degree because the approach for problem solving in that course of study aligned with how I thought. And I felt that it gave me really good problem solving skills. So I studied electrical engineering. I did a bunch of computer programming. And while I ultimately didn't use my degree for electrical engineering in the Coast Guard, the leadership skills and everything that I learned at the Coast Guard Academy helped me to be a better officer once I graduated and commissioned. You mentioned one other master's degree. So maybe after 3 years from graduating from my undergraduate degree, I chose to pursue an online program to further my education. And project management was something that I felt was very applicable and interesting to me. So I started taking part-time classes online, just one at a time. And over a course of about 2.5 years, I was able to complete a master's degree while also balancing my full-time career in the Coast Guard. And it was great to learn from others that were also in similar situations, pursuing their degrees and wanting to just learn more. I consider myself a lifetime learner and really get passionate. I really, really enjoy being in a classroom and learning from others' experiences. And that was the chance for me to do that early in my career.
Yeah, absolutely. And I agree. It's, a quote that I remember is someone saying that, once you stop learning, essentially, you start dying at that point. So you got to continuously relearn. But it seems like you really thought about all the aspects, before you made your decision to go into Coast Guard. You thought about all the aspects and, benefits that, you'd be able to gain from it. And we're kind of thinking about your path already. So when you chose the Coast Guard, I know that you said all the benefits that would come with going to Coast Guard Academy. Did you also think about other branches of service? Like, did you do like pros and cons, or did you just look at the Coast Guard and, it all aligned with your goals and you were like, that's where I'm going?
For me, the Coast Guard was really unique. I knew that I wanted to serve in some branch of the military, but what differentiated the Coast Guard from the other branches was its humanitarian mission. It's focused on saving lives and doing good for the community, whereas the other branches are more warfighting and overseas missions that are more on the aggressive front. And so the idea that I could be part of the military, focus on national security and saving lives, that was something that I thought was really cool and unique. And another part of the Coast Guard that I found to be very interesting and specific to our organization is its size. So there's only 60,000 people in the Coast Guard, which means that every single person has a lot of different responsibilities. And so you don't get stuck going down a path where you're going to do the same job for 20 years. I like to try and experience new things, new jobs. I think that's, just comes with my personality of being a lifelong learner. And so the idea that you could change roles and responsibilities every few years was really appealing to me. And when we get a chance to talk about the different career steps that I've taken, you'll see that it seems like I've started a new career almost every single move that I've done. And I think that's one of the things that's kept me really engaged and interested in my job in the organization.
Yeah. And as you mentioned, my next question was kind of diving into your different roles. As you mentioned, you've spent over 10 years in the Coast Guard and you've kind of gone through different roles and different positions. Can you walk us through a couple of your professional, positions and your professional journey there? Maybe highlight a few roles and kind of what they entailed. I'm also curious to know where you were, within the country. I guess when somebody joins the Coast Guard, where are they positioned? Do you get a choice of where to go? And yeah.
Great question. So in terms of where I was when I joined the Coast Guard and the different places that you could assess and join into the Coast Guard, I'll start with just a brief overview. So there's two different paths in the Coast Guard. You can enlist. And if you enlist, then you essentially go through a 12-week boot camp that's located in Cape May, New Jersey. And there you're indoctrinated to learn about Coast Guard history, the different Coast Guard missions, and you get an introduction into what the Coast Guard does. As an enlisted member, you join the Coast Guard, you enlist and you graduate from boot camp. And then afterwards, you immediately get started and go to work. And then ultimately you choose a technical specialty. And so that could be as a machineries technician, as a law enforcement specialist, you could be a marine science technician, you could be a boat driver. You pick a technical specialty, and then that's the type of jobs that you'll fulfill for the rest of your career after you graduate from some sort of specialized training. So in an enlisted role, you're, again, more of a technical expert. You're doing more hands-on work, and you become really, really good at one of those areas of expertise. You might get to dabble in a couple of other areas, but you're mostly focused on your rate, which is the one that you choose shortly after you complete boot camp. As an officer, there's a requirement to have some level of college education. And so if you are to become an officer, there's a few different ways to commission. There's a program called Officer Candidate School, where you essentially go through a 17-week training program that is located in New London, Connecticut, at the Leadership Development Center that's co-located with the U.S. Coast Guard Academy. You go through this program, and then you come out as an officer, where you're more filling a managerial supervisory role. And it's more for structure, even though you might be a supervisor, a leader responsible for a division, leading individuals who have more experience than yourself. You're ultimately the one that's responsible for that division. So you learn from your other enlisted team members that are serving in that division. The last path, which is the one that I followed, was attending the U.S. Coast Guard Academy. It's a 4-year degree, very similar to experiences that you would have at the Air Force Academy, Annapolis, West Point. Those are all service academies. The U.S. Coast Guard Academy, again, located in New London, Connecticut, is a 4-year program that blends academics and leadership training at the same time. So that's more or less how you get into the Coast Guard. And then in terms of my career, I'll just take you through the different steps and responsibilities. As I've reflected my career, so I started attending the Coast Guard Academy 16 years ago. That was when I graduated high school and started my journey. I spent 4 years at the Coast Guard Academy and then graduated and commissioned as an officer. And my first assignment was on a ship. I was the assistant navigation officer. So that meant that I was responsible for planning the transits for the ship. In a car, you've got a GPS, you pull up Google Maps and it'll tell you exactly where to go. On a ship, you have some electronic navigation systems, but you need to manually input the route because there's not specific roads. And so my role and the division that I was responsible for was building those paths to make sure that our ship safely navigated from one point to another. Our mission on the ship was focused primarily on law enforcement. And so we spent a lot of time in the Caribbean doing counter-narcotics missions, as well as some fisheries enforcement operations to protect the natural resource of our fish in the many different seas that we patrolled in. From there, that was located in Boston, Massachusetts. So while our ship was out of Boston, Massachusetts, we were traveling up and down the East Coast and down into the Caribbean and off of South America to conduct the many missions that we did.
Wow.
From there,
Okay.
I was transitioned to a team in New Orleans, Louisiana. I was a part of an anti-terrorism team. And so what we did was we deployed around the country for major events and gatherings and conducted maritime security to prevent any sort of terrorist threat and act as a deterrent. So that was a really unique mission. While I was there, in addition to doing some anti-terrorism work, that was our primary mission. We also ended up helping with search and rescue cases during Hurricane Harvey in Texas. And that was an unreal storm. We weren't a search and rescue unit, but everybody pitched in and helped during that natural disaster. From there, I had a chance to go back to the U.S. Coast Guard Academy and serve as a staff officer there, where I was part of the administration and supporting the superintendent. And so I got a chance to support the training and leadership development of the 1,000 cadets that are at the Coast Guard Academy at any given time. And then my last job before coming to Sloan was located once again in Boston, Massachusetts. And you'll see a trend. I've been lucky enough to spend a lot of my career in Boston and really lucky to be here. Boston is considered the birthplace of the Coast Guard, this greater area, just because that's where the Revenue Cutter Service, the Revenue Cutter Marine, was formed in Newburyport, just north of Boston. So I had a chance to come back to the birthplace of the Coast Guard. Here, my role before Sloan was I was leading pollution investigation and response missions in the greater Boston area. Just if there was an oil spill or any sort of hazardous material incident that occurred in the maritime domain, my team was responsible for ensuring that it got corrected and that we were protecting the environment and the community. And then I played a role in search and rescue coordination and supporting search and rescue responses in the greater Boston area.
Yeah,
so that's a big overview of my career. And now I'm at MIT Sloan.
Wow, thank you for sharing that. And I want to dive into some of those areas that you talked about. But before we dive in, are you from Boston? Is that where you grew up?
I'm not from Boston, but I feel like it's really close to my heart. Boston is where I met my wife. Boston is a place that I have some family in. I personally grew up in central New Jersey. I was born in New York and grew up in New Jersey, but lived a great part of my life in Boston. And so it's a place that's really close to me and that I like spending time in and living in.
Yeah. Awesome. So going back to, the 3 ways that you said you could kind of join the Coast Guard. One of them was the boot camp. Can you give quick overview of what a boot camp for Coast Guard entails, how long it is, and kind of what you have to go through?
Certainly. So boot camp for the Coast Guard is a 12-week program. So essentially, you meet with a recruiter, you'd sign up, and you'd obligate to go to boot camp. And that's where essentially you're starting your military indoctrination, which means that you're learning about the service, learning about courtesies and customs, learning about how to prepare your uniform. And then there's a physical component too. So as part of boot camp, very early mornings, and going late into the night. And it's really, there's multiple reasons that you go through boot camp. One is to ensure that you're committed to joining the organization. And the second part is to really learn how to come together and be part of an organization that's bigger than yourself. Mm-hmm. They talk about how at boot camp, at any of the indoctrination trainings, you come in as an individual, but you leave and graduate as a team. And through any boot camp, whether it's Coast Guard, Navy, Marine Corps, Army, you won't be able to make it through by yourself. So you need to learn how to work with others, rely on others, and come together to accomplish tasks that you would not be able to do by yourself. So all in all, it's a 12-week program that you show up, you start, and physical in nature, early mornings, late nights. You don't have your cell phone during the day. So really your focus is just to integrate and become part of the organization before you're sent to your first assignment.
Yeah. Is there a strong focus on, I guess, being a strong swimmer? Being in the Coast Guard, is that like a focus area of theirs? And are you a strong swimmer as well?
That's a great question. So, am I a great swimmer? I'm a very mediocre swimmer, and being an exceptional swimmer is not a requirement to be in the Coast Guard. You do need to be able to pass a basic swimming test. However, I will add a caveat to that. We have some of the best swimmers in the world in the Coast Guard, and if that's what your aspiration is, to be a rescue swimmer like Ashton Kutcher in the Guardian, then there's
That
a special
I want to
program.
I want to
Yeah.
touch on that later on too. That's great that you brought that up.
Um, Certainly, yeah. So you don't have to be a great swimmer to join. There's many jobs that don't require you to be a rescue swimmer, and you can contribute to the organization without jumping in the water and saving a life yourself. But if that's what your goal is, to be a rescue swimmer and to go in crazy weather conditions, jump out of a helicopter and save lives, and you're a strong swimmer, then there's absolutely a special path for you in the Coast Guard. There's a second training that you go through after boot camp. You essentially would graduate from boot camp, and then you would make a request to go to a specialized school. It's called a school, and you would look to become an AST, an aviation survival technician. And so in that training, I think it's like a 4-month training program where essentially you're doing lots of physical fitness and physical training, crazy swimming tests. There's a lower graduation rate for people that enter into the AST field. But if you desire to become an aviation survival technician, then there is a path for you where you could join the Coast Guard. While not everybody in the Coast Guard is an exceptional swimmer, there is a path for you to become a rescue swimmer like Ashton Kutcher in The Guardian, if you are. And so what that would look like is that you would go to boot camp. After boot camp, you would graduate and you would put your name on a special school list called A School. The specific rate is the AST, the Aviation Survival Technician, which is our rescue swimmers in the Coast Guard. And then once you got off that list, you'd go to a specialized training program that focuses on rescue swimming tactics, where there's significant swimming requirements that you'd have to get through to ultimately graduate and become an AST. So there's many jobs in the Coast Guard that don't require you to be a great swimmer and that you can contribute to the organization, but not every single person is an exceptional swimmer like our ASTs.
Okay, nice. That's good to know. And I'll touch back on The Guardian and on that movie because I've seen that movie and my perception was that you have to be an exceptional swimmer to join the Coast Guard, but that's good to know. And I'm sure a lot of our viewers were kind of expecting that too. But we'll touch back on that a little bit down the line. So my next question is, after you spent a decade in the Coast Guard, I'm sure you've experienced some intense situations, some intense missions that you've been on. Are you able to share one or two, some of the most high stake moments and missions that you faced and kind of how you dealt with those on high pressures?
Sure. So in terms of intense, high risk, thrilling missions, as I think back on my experience, I'll set the stage a little bit for what was going through my mind and where I was in my career. So I graduated from the Coast Guard Academy. I was 22 years old and commissioned as an ensign and first assigned to that ship that I told you about out of Boston, Massachusetts. But one of our big missions was a counter-narcotics mission down in the Caribbean. And so we're off patrolling on the ship. We're off the coast of Honduras, and we got a notification that there was a smuggling vessel that was attempting to smuggle contraband, suspected narcotics from Honduras, and ultimately likely with the goal of getting to the United States. And so in addition to being one of the ship drivers, one of my side responsibilities was I was part of the law enforcement boarding team. And so in a situation like this, the law enforcement boarding team, they put on, their bulletproof vests, they grab their firearms, and then you jump into a small boat, a boat that's maybe 25 feet in size, and you launch the boat from the big boat. You put the small boat into the water and you start a pursuit. Now, this was my first counter-narcotics law enforcement mission. It's like 1 a.m, totally dark outside, and we're going, full speed ahead, trying to catch this vessel. And you don't know what you're gonna encounter. You don't know what they have on board or how many people they have. And so our goal was just to catch them. I kind of laughed.
Pitch black.
Yeah, it's totally pitch black outside. You've got, night vision goggles. You're trying to see where they are, and you're getting redirected by the boat, the bigger, like our cutter, our ship. they have a better radar, they have infrared cameras, and so they're able to kind of redirect you towards that. I kind of laugh now because this is one of those situations where my heart was rushing, and we didn't actually catch them in this situation, but just the thrill of being out at sea, underway in a small boat, and a chase like that. As a 22-year-old,
I can't even imagine.
yeah, that was a highlight and something that I don't think many people have a chance to experience something like that.
You've essentially lived the movie. I mean, when you're describing what this mission, like that's a movie right there. Like I said, pitch black in the middle of the ocean. How many people would you guys you said you guys went on a small boat, probably more faster speedboat to go after them. How many people do you guys have with you?
Sure. So on our cutter, the bigger ship, we have 100 people on board. And then on a small boat, you'd put 4 or 5 people on board. So 25 feet in length, everyone grabs one of the seats. And those boats, they're meant to be quick and agile to essentially be able to catch another, to be more maneuverable and to be able to catch another boat that's going quite fast.
That's intense. That's crazy. So you said in this situation, you guys weren't necessarily able to catch them. But let's say you do catch up to that boat. What's like the procedure? How do you get on board there? How do you actually detain them? How do you get on there? How do you encounter them?
Certainly. So in a situation like that, your hope is that you've got your blue light, law enforcement light going, then you are pursuing them, and you hope that they stop, that they listen to your commands, and that they stop. I think one of the reasons, in addition to being an officer, that I was on that small boat is that I'm also fluent in Spanish. So it's a great skill when you're operating in South America or in the Caribbean to be able to communicate with someone that might not be able to speak English. And so you're going to give them commands when you get alongside them in English and in Spanish to essentially stop the boat. You hope that they stop, but if they don't, then ultimately the Coast Guard has the authority to disable the vessel. So the goal is to stop them, and that could be by shooting out their engines. It could be, just by somehow otherwise disabling their vessel. And once you finally stop them, then it becomes a law enforcement stop, and people are going to end up in handcuffs, and you're going to check to see what contraband they have on board.
Wow. Did you ever encounter that type of situation where you guys were, kind of telling them to stop, but they didn't, and you guys had to take the next step?
So me personally, I was never on a boat where we had to engage in the next level of use of force, but many times in the Coast Guard, you'll have situations where you have to escalate to a higher level of use of force. There's some really cool videos on YouTube, and you could search Coast Guard pursuit, even one of a Coast Guard law enforcement specialist jumping on board a submarine and, hammering down on the hatch and telling him to alto su barco, which means stop your boat, and ultimately leading to a very big interdiction. So it doesn't happen all the time, but it does happen.
So you mentioned submarines. So are some of these pursuits, were they on boats usually, or they could have been on submarines, and I guess your bigger boat kind of detects them based on the radar?
Sure. So there's many different smuggling tactics. One tactic is using a boat called the Go Fast that has a lot of engines mounted on the back, and it's called the Go Fast because it goes very fast. And so the goal for a Go Fast is to get from one point to another as quickly as possible, carrying whatever they're carrying. Some of the other strategies that have been used over the last 20 years include self-propelled semi-submersibles. So they're not completely underwater submarines, but they might have a small superstructure, maybe a little viewing area that you can see from the top, but a large portion of it is transiting underwater. So those are interdictions that the Coast Guard has seen over the last 20 years.
And I'm guessing that's probably the case where you're saying in these videos, they jump on it and they're trying to get in, right? Because I was like, what if it is a submarine and they just go down? And I guess at that point, you can't really chase them at that point.
I'll flag that that's not standard Coast Guard procedure to jump on board a submarine. and generally that wouldn't be the path that someone chooses. But in this case, adrenaline is rushing, and they saw an opportunity to get on board and hopefully seize the drugs. And in the end, they were successful in seizing what was an incredibly large amount of drugs and having a successful drug bust.
Yeah, I'll check out that video because if it's on YouTube, I'm sure it was successful and they got on. So I'll check that one out. But now I kind of want to take a look at, and maybe you have kind of the different perspective on your missions. Was there any mission or operations that sort of gave you chills? Maybe you consider that a major milestone in your career, or something that reminds you why you joined the Coast Guard in the first place?
So one of the missions that I hold really close to my heart, and it's one that was an absolute catastrophe, a natural disaster, this Hurricane Harvey in Texas. And so I set the stage a little bit for you. There was a rainstorm, a hurricane that came through, and it just parked itself over the greater Houston area. And for 5 days, it rained nonstop, with some areas getting more than 50 inches of rain. And so this was an area where it wasn't supposed to flood. It was a 500-year flood zone, and you just got 50 inches of water that came down. So the city was not prepared for a storm of this magnitude. They did their best to prepare, but you just don't expect 50 inches of rain at any point in time. We, from New Orleans, Louisiana, we traveled to Houston, Texas, and assisted with the efforts to reconstitute the city and to evacuate people that had been stuck in their homes. The homes, any street that you'd be driving down, there were some areas where you literally couldn't even see the street sign. The cross where you see the street sign that says Main Street, North Avenue, completely covered underwater. You could see just the tip of the roofs of the houses. And that was the reality of the situation, an area that wasn't supposed to flood that experienced a complete catastrophe. So what we did was we traveled. I mentioned before that we were part of an anti-terrorism team, but everybody stepped up in the Coast Guard and contributed in some level during a natural disaster of this magnitude. And we just showed up and saw what we could help. So my team got there a few days before me, and they used these inflatable craft. They're called combat rubber raiding craft that the Navy and the Navy SEALs use for many different missions, but they're also very effective for urban search and rescue. And so they essentially went around to neighborhoods and went to find where people might need to be evacuated. They came across a nursing home that had a whole bunch of residents. The water was starting to come up. And so they assisted with the evacuation of elderly and sick residents that otherwise might have been stuck in the nursing home. And so that was a big mission that I got to be a part of. And when I got there, I had to lean on my team. I had to ask them, the people that were from Houston, that were familiar with the areas and from the surrounding areas, ask them, based on your advice, based on what you're hearing, where do you think we should focus our efforts? When I got there, so we continued our search efforts, and by that point, most of the people had been evacuated. So we focused on saving pets that had been left behind in a state of emergency. Sometimes people aren't able to bring their pets with them. So we focused on ensuring that the pets that had been left behind were brought to shelters and didn't perish in the storm.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. I know that was a terrible time for many people, and you're essentially, a hero to a lot of people's eyes, showing up at their worst times in their lives and kind of helping them regroup and same like. So I appreciate you sharing that story. I wanted to kind of take a, step back and take a deeper look into, day-to-day of a Coast Guard, right? A lot of people don't know what the day-to-day looks like. I know we've kind of talked about some of your missions and some of your rescues, what it took and what it involved. But I want to kind of look at, especially at different ranks. Can you give us a glimpse of your typical routine and kind of how it shifted as you moved up through different ranks, right? It could involve some of the missions, but I know we've kind of covered, some of your missions and what they entailed. I want to know more of like the day-to-day routines of the different ranks.
Definitely. I'll say I'll focus on the officer side. So I talked about how I went to the Coast Guard Academy, commissioned as an officer, and immediately was put in charge of a division. Now, early in my career, what was interesting about this is that while I was leading a division, I was the least experienced person on that team. And I was probably the youngest person on that team too. To kind of put that into context, think about being a 22-year-old and you're responsible for a team that has 30, 35-year-olds that have been in the Coast Guard for, 10, maybe 15 years, that have a lot of experience and are very familiar with the different missions. And so how I approached that was taking it as a learning opportunity to learn from these individuals who are very seasoned and experienced, and who, while they might have been serving under my leadership, they were ultimately much more knowledgeable in the areas that we were focusing on and working in. And so I just kind of worked alongside them. And on the ship, kind of what that looked like was our role was to prepare for our next deployment, for our next going out to sea. And so we did everything on paper charts. We were focused on building those the safe navigation plans. And so a lot of our work focused on building safe navigation plans, looking at charts, making sure that our charts were the most recent and up-to-date versions. And then from there, again, just preparing. And so making sure not only that we were ready for the navigation part, but then also maintaining our physical fitness, going through scenarios. So talked about a little bit of the law enforcement that we did while we were out at sea. Some of that was counter drug. Some of that was other, fisheries enforcement. And so doing training and drills where you simulate how you might respond to a situation, how you might lead a boarding, how you might put someone in handcuffs, how you might respond if someone escalates to a higher level of force where maybe they're not complying with what you need them to comply with to ensure that you can conduct a safe boarding. How do you respond to situations like that? So at the end of the day, our work was broken up kind of into training and preparation and then actual deployment. And so when you're on deployment, when you're on a mission, your focus is ensuring the safe execution of that mission and supporting the higher organizational goals, which, are search and rescue, law enforcement, and protecting the environment. Those are the main ones that we focused on.
Yeah, makes sense. Was there any between like all the different positions and ranks that you've held, was there one that you enjoyed the most? I guess within like the duties and the day-to-day activities.
I really liked my time at the anti-terrorism team that I served at in New Orleans, Louisiana. One thing that you find, whether in the Coast Guard or any organization, is that as you rise in the ranks, the opportunities that you get to do the cool things and being out in the field, being out on the boats, you become more of a supervisor and manager and coordinator where you're not actually in the field doing all those things as you get more senior. So I was in New Orleans, Louisiana about 2 years after I graduated from college. So I was like 24, 25 years old. And at this point in time, I had a chance to learn all our different security tactics. I got to work on the small boats. I got to travel and conduct really cool missions that, as I've gotten more senior, I've been more in the office. I enjoy getting a chance to be out and working in the field. But at the end of the day, being a good leader sometimes means that you put that to the side and you have to stay back and facilitate those opportunities for others and do more high-level coordination that allows your team to conduct the mission. Because you're only one person. So if you're trying to do a mission you're out in the field, then there's things that you're letting go that need to be coordinated for your team to be successful.
Yeah, absolutely. Makes sense. I want to touch back on the movie that you mentioned, The Guardian, with Ashton Kutcher. I actually I wanted to ask you about it, so I'm glad you mentioned that. I was like 99% sure you've watched it because it's about the Coast Guard.
A lot of times, yeah.
But I wanted to ask you, I guess, how accurate it is. I understand now from listening to you about different parts of the Coast Guard, different roles and positions, that the movie, it's more focused on the rescue swimmers, and that's just really one aspect of the Coast Guard. How accurate is it, though? Is that, because I see, the tough weather conditions that they go into, and throughout the movie, we do see, few of those people, lose their lives, right, in crazy tough conditions. Yeah, so I want to kind of get your take on the movie and how accurate it is to real life rescue swimmers and the circumstances that they face.
The movie is absolutely based on the reality of what the life of a Coast Guard rescue swimmer is, the conditions that you could be in. So oftentimes it's in areas where there's really heavy seas. It could be a very bad storm and people are at their absolute worst point in life where their boats have broken down and they're really at the mercy of the sea. And this is their last chance, potentially for a rescue. So that aspect is accurate. At the training facility that I talked about for our aviation survival technicians, they have a weather simulator that they can make an entire pool go dark, simulate rain, lightning, and all these different conditions, waves, things that you would actually experience when you're out conducting one of these rescues. And so that's accurate. And in terms of how they launch people from the helicopters, they'll drop rescue swimmers from a helicopter into the water, and they will swim and conduct a rescue. So there's aspects of it that might be a little bit exaggerated, but yeah, it's true that our rescue swimmers are very noble, courageous individuals that have to put themselves in some tough situations. A lot of the Coast Guard. So we talked about the different jobs that exist in the Coast Guard where you can support all the different missions, even if you're not an actual rescue swimmer. So I can share a story about how I had a chance to do that as an officer. At my last unit in Boston, I was part of the search and rescue coordination team. So we have a centralized command center where if you find yourself in a situation where maybe your boat is, you took your boat out for the day and your boat is taking on water, you don't know what to do, you can call the Coast Guard, and that gets routed to a centralized coordination center in the area. And then from there, that team helps to coordinate the search and rescue response. And so myself as an officer, I was part of the search and rescue watch team. And we received calls for search and rescue cases where we had to sometimes send a helicopter, send a small boat to render assistance to a boat that was on fire or some sort of medical emergency. And in one case, kind of going back to your question about the Guardian and how we responded to different search and rescue cases, there was a cruise ship that had a medical emergency. We were in some pretty unstable sea states and it was low visibility. The boat was rocking back and forth, but someone had a stroke and they needed medical assistance to mitigate the impact of the stroke. And so that call came into our command center. And what we did was we were able to coordinate a helicopter to go and meet the cruise ship. From the helicopter, they dropped the rescue basket. They put one of the aviation survival technicians down to help to load the person in. And they were able to conduct a medical evacuation to get that person the very important medical help that they needed from a hospital and medical professionals.
Wow. Like I said earlier, movie. The experiences, the life you've been through is a movie, especially at a young age, 22, 23, 24. These intense situations, I can't even imagine. One last question about these that you mentioned. Let's say you mentioned that the boat might have been on fire or it's taking on water. What happens to the boat? Does it get left out there? You guys rescue the people, but what happens to the boat that's kind of taking on water, let's say, or it's on fire?
So in a situation where a boat is taking on water, our first priority is going to be to save the lives of the people on board and to make sure that they're not injured. And then our next goal would be to save and protect the property if we could. And so if a boat is taking on water, what that might look like is we might assist by putting a pump on board and helping to dewater the vessel. If it's on fire, we might coordinate with the local fire department, some of which have fire response boats that are actually able to extinguish the fire. If we're able to save and protect the property, then we absolutely will. But our goal is to protect the people and avoid putting ourselves in a situation where we might injure our crew just to be able to save property.
Yeah. If the boat's not like functioning, do you guys like hook it and drag it back to shore? Like, how does that work?
Yes. So if the boat's broken down, then we could sometimes assist with bringing it back. It kind of depends on what other missions are going on. And then there's commercial providers as well. And so we never want to take business away from the public. Our goal is emergency response and responding in emergencies. And so if there's a way where the individual can coordinate with a local commercial provider to tow their boat back to a safe place, then that, barring an emergency where we had to get it out of a navigable waterway or a situation where it might impact traffic or cause some other issues, then the preference would generally be to allow a commercial provider to do that.
Makes sense. Next, I want to kind of cover, some of the challenges and lessons that you've learned over 10 years plus your academic pursuits. You must have faced challenges, maybe with operational hurdles, balancing work with study. I know at times you said you were doing multiple things or kind of adapting to new roles. What were some of the obstacles you've encountered, or what would you say was the biggest challenge that you faced, during your 10 years in the Coast Guard or even post that?
One of the biggest challenges that I've overcome and learned from is that you can only accomplish so much as an individual, and you really have to work together as a team to reach your full potential. Early on in my career, I think myself, like a lot of the shipmates and people that I serve with, we're high achievers. We want to do a great job, and we have a vision for how we see things getting done. And that sometimes means that you're very in the weeds doing things, and you might actually be taking opportunities away from others to learn and do. And so early on in my career, I had a mentor, a supervisor of mine who, coached me and taught me that you have to trust your team. You have to empower them to succeed, and they'll really amaze you with what they are able to accomplish individually. And the best part is that they'll learn as a result. They'll be better for it, and your team will accomplish so much more. And so that, I would say, was a change in mindset, especially as I was in a leadership role where I couldn't be the one to do everything myself. I had to lean on others and find ways to collaborate. And I really look back on that as a great learning experience. And I'm also really proud of the people that I've had a chance to lead and serve with, is how far they've come and how much they've learned, and just the great officers and individuals that they've become.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. And, that lesson that you said you learned kind of bridges to my next point and next question, which is now you're at MIT Sloan pursuing an MBA. That's a big shift, going from hands-on rescue operation at the Coast Guard. Now you decide to focus on business school. How does your, I guess, Coast Guard background influence, how you tackle classes, and kind of what made you make that shift and transition and say, I want to go to MIT and I want to pursue an MBA degree?
Sure. So my path to MIT is an interesting one. And I've talked about my Coast Guard career, how I've had a chance to conduct so many different missions. And as I thought about the next step in my career, I really thought about the impact that I could have on the Coast Guard as an organization, and where I could really influence the future of the service. And for me, that was in a role where I would be responsible for government funds and influencing where those funds were spent. And so I was lucky enough to be selected for a program where the Coast Guard gives me a chance to go to school to earn a business degree, and then I come back to the Coast Guard afterwards and fill a financial management role. So when I graduate in May, I'll be heading back to the Coast Guard as a lieutenant commander and filling a funds management role where I'll be working on Coast Guard budget and allocation of budget to the most pressing missions. So the chance to be able to bring my experience from the field and from many different areas of the Coast Guard into a place where I could now share those experiences and look for ways to spend the allocated budget in a way that really supports those missions, how they need to be supported, was something that I valued. In terms of MIT, the MIT program, there was a couple things that stood out to me as it was that made it different from others. So the MIT Sloan mission is to develop principled and innovative leaders that want to have an impact, positive impact on the world. And I felt like that really aligned closely with the Coast Guard's mission of just, improving our country and improving the world as a whole. And the other piece is my grandfather went to MIT. He came to the U.S. in 1950. He graduated from MIT. And so the opportunity to be part of a legacy of attending such an incredible institution was something that was special to me. So that's kind of how I ended up at MIT, and how I approach my studies at MIT is the same as how I've approached the experiences in the Coast Guard, is that everyone has unique experiences and brings different skill sets to the table. Business and military work, you'd think that they're so different, but I think that the feelings, the stress, and the pressure in a search and rescue case or in a combat environment, you could equate that to the same natural response that your body has to a business situation where you've got a pressing deadline, where you have, people that are, kind of breathing down your neck to get something accomplished. The stress is the same. And so I take this opportunity as a chance to learn from very successful individuals in businesses and other different sectors to improve myself and how I lead and operate. I think at the end of the day, there's so much innovation and there's so much growth in business, and there's a lot of efficiencies that I feel that I can learn from best practices that my classmates have had in their respective industries that I hope to be able to bring back to my organization.
Wow, that's awesome. You kind of already answered. I was going to ask what your goals are after you finish your MBA, but you'll be going back to Coast Guard. I guess indefinitely. I was gonna say if you have plans of kind of going into the business world, outside of the Coast Guard. But I guess, that's for the future. But for anyone who's listening and who might be aiming for a top tier MBA, school like MIT, do you have any insights on what schools like MIT look for in applicants? And, let's say there are undergrad students right now or young professionals out there. How can they position themselves to get an acceptance letter or get an opportunity?
So getting into a top business school, I think is like it's like a job interview, and it's something that you prepare for some time. So I think the first and most important thing for thinking about an MBA and applying to an MBA program is you need to start early, and you really need to start by preparing with, taking the requisite tests, making sure that you have a good reason for why you want to go to business school. And I would say the second piece that plays into that is thinking about, why do you want to go to business school, and how can you tell a story and shape your experiences into a story that really creates a compelling vision for how this business school experience is going to help you not only to achieve your goals, but also how you're going to be able to share your experiences and influence the future and careers of others. I talked about how in my time at MIT Sloan, how I've learned so much from my classmates. You really want to be able to capture that and highlight how you're going to enrich the experience of other students who are also part of your program. And so kind of tying together your work experiences and how everything that you've done to this point makes it the perfect time for you to be in business school, and then your vision for what you'll accomplish after your MBA program. I think that is how you put your best foot forward and how you're able to essentially get into the best programs. I think, beyond that, having strong academic foundation with ability to work with data and, quantitative capacity, whether that means that you studied some sort of math or engineering or science in your undergrad studies, or that you've continued your education and have focused your work in some sort of quantitative in some fields. I think those are things that are important to look at as you're applying to different schools.
Yeah, I really like that. Like you said, having strong foundations, but also understanding that it's not just about you learning and you take things away, but also being able to give back to your classmates, the institution that you'll be joining, kind of like all around. So taking it, we kind of talk about what the best advice for students to position themselves to join a top tier MBA school. Let's say if someone is out there right now thinking that they want to join the Coast Guard, what would you tell them in terms of, pitfalls to watch out for, or I guess must-do steps in order to succeed? Because as you mentioned, what you went through for the Coast Guard, all the trainings that you did, all the missions that you went through, those are not easy. So someone listening out there, they might be like, that's intense. That's crazy. I don't know if I'll be able to do it. What would your suggestion be to them and your advice for them to succeed in that field? So
to succeed in the Coast Guard, I would say the first step is to do your research. Great resource that you can look at is gocoastguard.com. So if you visit gocoastguard.com, then you'll essentially have a chance to be able to connect to a recruiter, to watch videos, to learn about the overall organizational mission. And there's also a checklist that you can follow to essentially work through to see what you might need to do to be prepared to either become an officer or to enlist in the Coast Guard and go to that boot camp in Cape May, New Jersey. And so I would say that's one key step, is kind of knowing what you're getting into. If you've set your minds on it, then similar to preparing for an MBA program, I would say start early. So get organized. There's medical exams that you're going to need to do ahead of time. And then when you get to boot camp, there's physical fitness requirements as well. So you want to show up to boot camp ready and fit to tackle what the following weeks are going to be during boot camp. And you can do that by running, doing push-ups, lifting weights, lots of sit-ups, and just getting your body ready for what might be a challenging handful of months as you're going through boot camp. And then the last thing is just make sure that your mind's in the right place and that it's something that you're really committed to. I think it's an incredible organization, and there's a lot of very talented and capable individuals that would be a great fit for the Coast Guard. And you just want to make sure that your mind's in it for the right reasons, that you're ready and prepared to show up to boot camp or to come to officer candidate school or to get to the Coast Guard Academy, and that you're really in it for the long run, because it's very rewarding and very fruitful if you put your mind to it and you're really committed to the mission.
Yeah, makes sense. And I hope there is people out there, someone out there listening that's kind of considering the Coast Guard and, takes your advice and kind of pursues that field. My next question is kind of, not necessarily directly related to Coast Guard MBA, but if you had to suggest one book, something that either shaped your thinking or helped your leadership style, change your perspective, and it's kind of helping you along your, career journey, what would that book be? And I know we're into 2025 just now, so there might be a lot of listeners that are kind of out there like, want to start reading books and they're looking for new books to cover. What would your suggestion be there? And I'm looking for a suggestion as well. So
great question. So I'm a huge Malcolm Gladwell fan, and he's got a book called Blink. Blink is all about trusting your gut and essentially how you make snap decisions and how you naturally come to a conclusion without even really thinking about it. And so how do you harness those snap decisions, those judgments, and trust your gut to make decisions in times of crisis and times of need, and just be confident in yourself? I think it's an incredible book, and I recommend Blink by Malcolm Gladwell as a good starting book for the year.
Blink, thank you. And I'm going to check that out. And hopefully, when we do our second episode in the future and we meet back up, I'll tell you about my thoughts on the book. But we're down to my last question. If you had to pick a motto or a guiding principle that essentially sums up your journey so far, what would that be? And you can take a second, think about that if you want.
I think a motto or theme that guides my experience in the Coast Guard comes from one of my old supervisors and a mentor of mine who I really look up to. He used to say, if you do what you love and you love what you do, you'll never work a day in your life. And so whether that means that you love the Coast Guard or you love something else or you're passionate about something, find something that you love and that you really enjoy and try to turn that into your career. So many people are focused on chasing status and a paycheck at the end of the day. And there's a lot more to life than that. You spend so much of your day-to-day working. You should find something that you're passionate about and that you love. And maybe you want to start a podcast like Career T because that's your passion. And that is such a great way to spend your time because you make a living doing it, and then you also really enjoy what you do, and you should enjoy the job that you do.
Well, thank you for sharing that, and I agree. Sometimes if people out there are not necessarily doing exactly what they fully enjoy, that's okay. But like you said, you can start something up on the side, kind of doing a day to day. It adds a little bit of flavor to your your days, your weeks, and essentially nothing happens over days. But that little by little kind of changes your perspective, and you never know where things are going to go. So thank you for sharing that. Norberto, I want to thank you so much for joining me on Career T today. It's been absolutely incredible hearing about your Coast Guard experience, your academic path, and your insights into leadership and strategy. I hope, and I'm sure our listeners got a ton of value from your story. Hopefully somebody out there, is deciding their path based on, the advice and the lessons that you gave today. So I want to thank you for coming on Career T today.
Zora, thanks so much for the time today and for giving me a chance to share my story. And look forward to hearing about the rest of the podcast that you have a chance to lead and coming back for a follow-on episode. So have a great new year and wishing you all the best going into 2025.
Thank you. And that's it for the episode today. If you enjoyed it, go ahead and hit the subscribe button. It helps a lot as we're trying to grow right now and in the early stages. Leave a comment or a review. If there is a industry or a job that you would like to hear more about from, the day-to-day workers in that field, leave a comment and we'll try to get guests in those fields as well. And share it. Also share in the comments if anyone out there who was inspired by Norberto's journey. I would love to read those comments and hear your thoughts as well. So thank you for tuning into Career T, and we'll see you guys in a week.